put it together, and I missed the top right there. Put it together, and we're back in overdrive. I did it again. But that is the idea. We know rotor pass from chapter 1. We learned rotor pass multiplier, or R.P.M, in chapter 2, which is an evolution of the rotor pass in that we're changing from simple swings, simple switches, right, simple passes from one hand to another, into wrist rolls before we pass. There's a kind of a step further, and I'm putting that in quotes for a reason that I'll talk about maybe towards the end, called rotor pass overdrive, which is what I like to call it. All right, so basically we are still doing everything that we did with rotor pass multiplier, except we are now adding in, instead of just passes from one hand to another, we're using throws as well, okay? So there are two ways to start the rotor pass multiplier, right? You can, and I'm not talking about the two different directions, right? I know we can come one way versus the other way, but right, what I'm talking about here is we can start at the top of the trick with a front to front type wrist roll that actually changes front to back because it lands in the other hand in the back grip, but basically a front to front wrist roll, right? You can start at the top of the trick or at the bottom of the trick. With the back to back wrist roll, that becomes a back to front because we're actually passing to the other hand, but I'll call it a back to back to keep things simple, right? Because it would be a back to back wrist roll if the new hand, catching hand, were not there, right? So, I prefer, just personally, to start with the backwards wrist roll at the bottom of the trick, and then to follow up with the forwards one at the front. So, with this, we're not adding in throws between both the backwards wrist roll throwing to the top hand and the forwards wrist roll throwing to the bottom hand. This is just the aesthetic that I've found I personally like best. You can do it either way, but what rotor pass overdrive looks like eventually is this. Without the failure. One more time. And I think you get the idea from there. But that's rotor pass overdrive. So how you execute this is throw a back-to-back wrist roll. It actually lands in this hand. When we throw the front to front, so this is the chuck that I'm holding, I switch hands to the other chuck, and the flop that brings the initial chuck that you were holding, right? Okay, chuck 0, chuck 1, or chuck 1, chuck 2. We wrist roll and grab chuck 2. Chuck 1 flops back over the top, right? And that just, the momentum just carries it through that arc. You use that arc and extend the arc into an inside-to-outside aerial, right? Which we learned back towards the end of chapter 1 if you go back and take a look at those videos, okay? So, front to front wrist roll by itself, extra flop. Front to front wrist roll by itself, extra flop. Work on turning that extra flop into the swing that you use to scoop back outside of your center line, right? Inside to outside, and toss. If we combine that now, start by just holding from the bottom of the trick, do your back-to-back wrist roll into your front grip. Front to front, now add it, and just catch. You don't have to continue the catch straight into the momentum of another wrist roll right now if you're not comfortable with that. We'll get there, okay? So start, again, back-to-back, catch, front to front, toss, and just grab it. Back-to-back, catch, front to front, toss, catch. So work on that first, then start with a front to front beforehand. Now this isn't like we're starting in the middle of rotor pass overdrive, this is like we're building up into it. But if we start instead of on the bottom of the trick, with the back-to-back and then continue, right? If that's roll 1, then roll 2 and a toss, we're now starting at like a roll 0, a roll 1, a roll 2 and a toss. This is just to get you used to the momentum of the fact that you're not starting rotor pass overdrive here just from scratch immediately tossing, right? But we're building up to it. So front to front, back to back, front to front. That front to front is our toss, not the initial one. So start with a kind of a front to front 0, front to front 0, back to back, that's 1, front to front 2, and catch. All right, 0, 1, time, 0, 1, 2, toss, catch. But actually catch. All right, this is just because if you go straight into Rotor Pass Overdrive, you can get a nice little aesthetic there, like so. But check one thing out, okay? This is if maybe I'm doing some sort of tricks here, and I transition, and I come straight into Rotor Pass, and I work it up to multiplier, and then I work multiplier up to overdrive. We get kind of a building feeling. The audience can tell that something is different from one trick to the next to the next. Okay. And I'm sorry, last part of just the technique is after the front to front toss, catch, don't just catch it, but ride that swing, right? So we snatch down and we snatch down on the nunchuck that I'm catching. Yes, my arm is doing this, but we ride that as a swing into our next swing, wrist roll. From there, right, so if you want to isolate this so that you don't have to incorporate all things together at once, just toss, catch, wrist roll. Again, toss, catch in a front grip, right? This is the downward snatch of an inside to outside aerial, right? So toss, catch, front to back wrist roll. Again, toss, catch, front to back wrist roll. From there, toss, catch, front to back wrist roll, catch in the new front grip. And this is the wrist roll that's going to throw. Again, put it together, and I missed the top right there. Put it together, and we're back in overdrive. I did it again. But that is the idea. Okay. So that's the technique side of things. I'm not going like as elaborately as I did maybe back in chapter 1, just because I'm hoping that with the experience that you have so far, if you're following along with the progression of the channel instead of just jumping in, you're welcome to also just jump in. You now have the exposure that I don't have to explain things for a super long time. All right. Now, if we talk a little bit about process, right? So that was technique. I called this in air quotes a step up from Rotor Pass Multiplier. If we take a look at Rotor Pass versus Rotor Pass Multiplier, you'll notice which looks more intense. And the answer, I'm going to use padded chucks because I'm starting to bruise the inside of my index finger knuckle here. But if you look at just Rotor Pass, flop, 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 versus Rotor Pass Multiplier, there's an entire whirlwind effect here that we don't get in the regular Rotor Pass. And the answer to this, just the physics of it, is a moment arm, right? If I take chucks and I swing them such that they're elongated like a stick, such that I'm keeping tension in the chain, this is the slowest possible, I guess the slowest possible if I hold it in far grip and extend my arm, but that's the slowest possible kind of spin that you can do with nunchucks, okay, physically. The fastest would be not actually a wrist roll, right? The reason why this is slow, if you think about it, is because we have a long moment arm, all right? How do we shorten the moment arm? Well, first of all, slide my hand closer to towards the chain. From there, I can wrist roll, and now if you just trace the path of a circle with your eye, this is the biggest circle, that's why it's slowest. The next smallest circle, if we just shrink our arms in, is a wrist roll, right? The next smallest circle is below a wrist roll, right? So there are things that are faster than wrist rolls, which are just regular spins, or wheels, some people call them. Like we learned in chapter 1, in our very first technique video with the shoulder passes, this kind of spin is the fastest you can possibly move the nunchucks, if we're just talking about efficiency in physics, okay? So Rotor Pass is a more elongated circle. If you look and trace the path of the end of the nunchucks with your eyes, the circle is about this big with just regular Rotor Pass. Rotor Pass Multiplier gets smaller because we are basically eating the chain with our hand. The chain is wrapping around our wrist, right? The since the chain is wrapping around our wrist, it's like we're losing the chain here, and we're shrinking up the moment arm that we're swinging around, okay? If you think about Rotor Pass Overdrive, it's a step up from Rotor Pass Multiplier or R.P.M. in that it's more difficult, right? This, you can kind of get it into a rhythm, but this breaks up the rhythm and makes it a little bit harder. In fact, I just messed up. Switching a pair of nunchucks does make it more difficult, but I am experienced, so I don't really have that much of an excuse, right? Yeah. Okay, so Rotor Pass Overdrive is more difficult. Does it look more intense? Again, this is multiplier. This is overdrive. There's something different about it, but it's not faster. The nunchucks are not moving in a more intense, vigorous speed, okay? They are moving in a more interesting pattern that's getting broken up, which might make it look more beautiful. But in terms of aesthetic, if you're performing, what I am trying to caution against, and this doesn't apply to just nunchucks, but to almost all, if not all, arts, and I'm careful with absolutes. More difficult things are not necessarily more of a big gun in your arsenal in performance, okay? If you do gymnastics, all right, and you can throw a backflip, that's a faster rotation than your back layout, even though a back layout is more difficult, or a back pike, or a back tempo, or a back whip, or whatever you call it. I know those are technically different things, but, right, there's some complexity that an audience does not appreciate because they don't also do the art that you do. They don't understand the little finer point that overdrive might be more technically harder to pull off than just RPM, okay? So I want to give you RPO, not so that you can just have it on your ego that you're doing a more complex thing, but partly because of that, right? You should feel like you're improving and capable of doing more and more complex things now, but more so to break up rhythms, because where there is change, your tricks and your performance does not get as stale, all right? So that's Rotor Pass Overdrive. So just keep in mind that we have multiple ways of spinning the chucks. We have elongated, right? More like Rotor Pass. We have this. You can throw in just like a spin for a second and then change it into a wrist roll, right? So I have my wheel spin, regular like normal, but I'm moving my arm now in a circle as I'm doing this. I can quickly change that into wrist rolls and even back again, although now I'm in a back grip, okay? And I can keep stuff like this going for a while and then even elongate it again, and then come back to wrist rolls and then come back to my spin here. Change directions, I get front to fronts, I get the other spin, etc., whatever I want, okay? And then we have our tosses. So this is just kind of those things that I've just showed you, elongated to wheel spins, to wrist rolls, to tosses. These are all on the frontal plane, but even just limited to the frontal plane, you have some things that you can do, and I want you to appreciate that and use it well in performance if you perform, and just by yourself for self-expression if you do nunchucks recreationally.